Welcome back to Chronicles on the Focus, the podcast where we delve into the history and stories behind the things that capture our attention. Today, we're taking a deep dive into the world of mixed martial arts, and specifically, the Ultimate Fighting Championship, or UFC, for short.
You know, Bob, I can't believe this is a thing. MMA, UFC, it's like a whole different planet. I've always been a fan of traditional boxing and wrestling, but this whole, no holds barred thing, it just blows my mind.
I hear you, Alice. But let's face it, the UFC is a phenomenon. From those early, chaotic days in the 90s to becoming a global, multi-billion-dollar juggernaut, it's been a wild ride.
Speaking of chaotic, let's talk about the early days. The whole War of the Worlds concept, with fighters from different disciplines going at it, that's just pure, unadulterated entertainment, right?
You bet it was. It was like watching a real-life video game. We had everything from kickboxing and taekwondo to sumo wrestling and even boxing, all in one event. And you know what was even more fascinating? The fact that those early fights didn't have many rules. Talk about a Wild West scenario.
Whoa, no weight classes. It's like a literal David versus Goliath situation. Remember that fight between Keith, the Giant Killer, Hackney and Emmanuel Yarbrough? That was wild. Yarbrough was over 400 pounds and a good foot taller than Hackney.
That was insane. But guess what? Hackney managed to pull off a submission win. It's a classic example of how the UFC's early days were all about finding out which fighting style was truly the best. It was less about technique and more about sheer willpower and grit.
Right, and that's what made it so captivating. It was pure, raw fighting, and the outcome was truly unpredictable. I guess that's why the UFC gained so much popularity so quickly.
And then came the Octagon, that iconic 8-sided fighting cage. It was designed to prevent fighters from escaping and to set the UFC apart from other combat sports.
You know, Bob, that's another interesting detail. Initially, they were going to use a traditional ring, but Rorion Gracie, one of the UFC's founders, was worried that fighters could escape during grappling. So they opted for a cage, and the Octagon became a symbol of the UFC. Talk about a genius move.
Absolutely. The Octagon became synonymous with the UFC, and it's been a defining element of the sport ever since. The UFC's early days were all about pushing boundaries and testing limits, and that's what drew so many people to it.
And it's still going strong, Bob. From its humble beginnings to its current status as a global powerhouse, the UFC has certainly come a long way.
It's amazing to think about how a sport that was initially seen as a novelty has become a legitimate global phenomenon. We'll be back next week with another episode of Chronicles on the Focus, where we'll delve deeper into the UFC's story. Until then, keep your eyes on the Octagon.